All right, well, welcome back. I think we've had a cracking start. I hope everyone agrees with that. I'm Sonia Palmieri. I'm stepping into the very big shoes of Jenna Price in chairing this session. Unfortunately, due to border closures, Jenna couldn't be with us today. However, this I think is an incredibly important session, and it's titled The Impact of Broader Patterns of Sexism and Racism in the Media and Political Discourse. And we know it's important because Kieran gave us in one slide 3 headlines that had been used to describe women in the law. And he said, but I could have chosen hundreds more. And we know that that's not a case of hundreds when it comes to women in politics. It's a case of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions. Anytime I get asked to do a presentation around women's political representation, the easiest slide is sexism in the media. So on that positive note, I'm delighted to start this discussion with a presentation from Andrea Carson. Andrea is an associate professor at the La Trobe University in Melbourne. Previously, people may know that she ran the Pathways to Politics program at the University of Melbourne. Her research is on communications and gender representation in politics and has recently turned her attention to local government, a big gender gap, as she'll call it. So without any further ado, Andrea.
Thank you, Sonia. I wish that we could be here with you all. I know a lot of work has gone into this conference, and I really thank the organisers, especially for their flexibility. We'll be talking about sexism more broadly in terms of some of the structural inequalities that we've found in local government. So hopefully you can see my slides there. And I want to go through what some of our findings have been. This is part of a much larger project that we're doing with the ARC, and the idea of the project is to capture a cohort of male and female councillors from the 2020 elections in October in Victoria across 76 councils all the way through to 2024. This has another layer to it in that the Victorian government has a target of gender parity by 2025. And this means that the Victorian government has just one more election of local councils in 2024 to reach that target. At the moment, the gender balance is 43.8%. So I won't go through the normative reasons why it's important to have gender parity. I think all the previous speakers have gone through that really clearly. One of the things we're looking at here is role strain theory. And I'm going to go straight to the headlines because we don't have a lot of time. What we found was a good news story and a bad news story. The good news story is that women are more electable than men. The bad news story is that fewer women are running for office or for local councils than what men are. And what we find is that there's a missing cohort, and this missing cohort is women under 45. There's also a missing cohort for men under 45, but it's not as pronounced as women, as we'll show. And it's also, we find that women are doing the lion's share of the housekeeping at home, of childcare compared to men. And of those women that do put their hand up for council, we find that, and are successfully elected, we find most of them have part-time work, whereas men that are of the same age are able to hold full-time work as well as have children and have a lot less responsibilities. The way that we went about this study was 2 surveys, one of candidates to see who was putting their hand up just before the October election when people were campaigning in September, and then we followed up with those who were successfully elected in December. When we analysed the data of the 2 surveys, we did see this missing cohort, so we added another component to the study, and that was interviewing in depth over 1 hour each 10 women that fitted into this under 45 cohort to see why they put their hands up and then pulled out, or why they only ran for 1 cycle of council. So that was the methodology. You can see from this graph that council's an older person's game. The average age was 51, and women tend to get in later because they're waiting after they've done those child rearing years before they put their hand up. This is less so men, as you can see with the colouring on this graph, the green, the men appearing earlier. And it also means that men have more electability and more experience. We found that of those that had successfully run for council for 3 terms or more, the figures were much higher for men. And this has consequences for the pipeline effect. Local council is a good training ground for other tiers of government. And so when we're looking at the federal sphere, if women aren't getting in earlier and getting these benefits of the training that local government offers, it has those flow-on implications. I want you to turn your attention to the final pillars in this graph, which shows the overall numbers. And here we can see, if we look at the orange, that even though fewer women are putting their hand up for office, their electability is higher. So this graph shows that 39.9% of the cohort that put their hands up for office were women, and yet 44.5% got elected. You'll notice a disparity here that 43.8 was the final figure. That's because 3 women resigned upon almost immediately after being elected, which dropped that level back somewhat. You can see with the blue bars being men that their electability was less as a proportion of the number putting their hand up for office. There's quite a bit of detail in this graph that I'll take you to the blue box at the top, which shows that when younger men do put their hand up, they're more able to do the full-time work and have children and juggle the council experience more so than what women are. And we can see, as I go to the next graph, where I want you to focus on the bars of women, especially those orange bars, that women aged 18 to 45 have more younger children. And as we go to the next graph, we'll see that they're doing much more of the housekeeping or home duties and much more of the childcare and rearing. You'll see some quotes there. This is from the qualitative interviews about what some of the women are feeling. And it goes to this theory of role strain, that they feel there's a real tension between being able to be a good counsellor as well as being an effective mother. And we don't see as much of this coming through in the survey work with the men. Again, here's some of the qualitative analysis that comes through. And it's also around with the part-time work that women feel they're putting their careers on hold. They have different motivations for going into council, which are much more community orientated. Men's motivations were more individualistic, and they feel they can't do this caregiving to the community as well as juggle the caregiving at home, as well as juggle the work that they want to put into developing their careers. And so many that were thinking about running for council pulled out at the last moment. And here are those graphs that I was talking about, where you can see a really stark difference with the younger cohort in terms of the childcare responsibilities and the housework responsibilities. And these are the candidates that were successful, that became councillors, where they're doing that lion's share. So what are the solutions to this? Well, the different councils in Victoria do offer subsidies for childcare, but there's a double bind here. The problem is that they vary across councils, and many women told us in the interviews that they didn't claim the subsidies because they're penalised in the media for claiming those subsidies at the end of the year, when local media go through and they see that the female councillors have much higher expenses. And unfortunately, it's not disaggregated. So their expenses might include taxis and childcare and all sorts of things, but it's much higher than their male cohorts, and they pay a price. And we saw examples of some of the media reporting of this, and so they choose not to claim the subsidies. And childcare also is often outside hours, so they're relying on grandparents. I'll finish up there because we want to get to the other speakers, but the take-home message is that there is a good news story here. Women are more electable, and COVID actually made it easier for many women to campaign online and to be adaptable. But the negative story is that they are feeling this double bind, this tension of role strain, which is becoming a big disincentive for women to put their hand up, which needs to be overcome if the Victorian government is going to reach its target of parity by 2025. Thank you for your time.
Role model timekeeping, Andrea. Love it. Thanks very much for your generosity and letting us hear from everyone. Really important points there around eligibility, electability, but also not wanting to be seen as claiming more than men in terms of childcare. And I know we've also spoken about maternity leave and those kinds of provisions and whether they exist in legislation at the local level. So lots of things to think about from Andrea's presentation. Next, we have a multimedia tour de force, a kind of a joint recorded presentation from Carol Johnson, supplemented by a live presentation from Blair Williams. Carol is an emerita professor of politics at the University of Adelaide, also an examiner of my thesis many years ago, wonderful woman. And Blair is a research fellow and lecturer with the newly established Global Institute for Women's Leadership here at the ANU. Thank you, Carol and Blair.
In this paper, Blair Williams and I analysed the treatment of women politicians in the Australian Parliament and print news media. Kate Ellis and Julia Banks's book revelations are not new. There's a long history of similar issues being written about. And despite increasing numbers of women MPs, there are still numerous recent complaints about sexism in Parliament. Our written paper provides a broader background information, but focuses on Julia Gillard's misogyny speech, Sarah Hanson-Young's complaints of slut-shaming, Julia Banks speaking out about sexism in Parliament. So we use examples from a Labor, Greens and Liberal politician. Our key arguments in the paper are: Parliament is still too often a sexist and toxic workplace for women. The news media often exacerbates this rather than critiquing it. Consequently, we need to change both Parliament and the media to improve the position of women parliamentarians and to increase the pressure on political parties by informed voters. Gillard's misogyny speech should be seen in the context of the history of sexist attacks on her by coalition politicians, including Abbott. Our analysis therefore reinforces Anne Summers' 2012 critique of Gillard's lack of, quote, rights at work, unquote. Our analysis of the misogyny speech is that Gillard was responding to Abbott accusing Speaker Peter Slipper of misogyny and accusing Gillard's government of hypocrisy for not acknowledging it. Despite many of her critics overlooking it, Gillard did criticise Slipper's sexism and anti-woman comments, as well as detailing and critiquing Abbott's own views on women. Sarah Hanson-Young, too, like Gillard, had a long history of sexist treatment, which had impacted on her ability to work in Parliament, including previous examples that she had identified as slut-shaming. Hanson-Young argues that sexist sledging was intentionally used in an attempt to put her off the game. And Leonhelm's comments were the final straw. But also significantly, he amplified those comments outside of Parliament, where he was not protected by parliamentary privilege. Note that the media facilitated those additional comments. And Hanson-Young makes it clear that she sees what she has experienced as a workplace issue. Julia Banks' observations are perhaps best made in her own words. She argues that equal representation is crucial but not enough. There's a need for an independent reporting system, including whistleblower protection, especially since she argues that Parliament was a worse workplace than many others she had experienced. She points out that, quote, often when good women call out or are subjected to bad behaviour, the reprisals, backlash and commentary portrayed them as the bad ones, the liar, the troublemaker, emotionally unstable or weak, or someone who should be silenced. Since our paper was submitted, She has explicitly implicated Scott Morrison in that behaviour, as indeed our paper had already suggested. I will now hand over to Blair to present her part of the paper.
Thanks, Carol. So the Canberra Press Gallery were largely submissive of Gillard's misogyny speech. And I'll just wait for my slides to appear, sorry. So what we did was examine the media coverage in the week following the misogyny speech back in 2012. And we've identified that the media largely framed it as playing the victim in addition to the gender card. There you go. As well as betraying, so-called betraying feminism, that her accusations about Abbott did not constitute sexism, and that she risked further isolating male voters. So I don't have time in this talk to give you all the examples, but there you have some on the screen there. So by calling out sexism and misogyny, Gillard transgressed the rules of the Parliamentary Boys Club and subverted traditional gender norms. Good women are supposed to support and comfort men, not confront and humiliate them by forcing them to face up to uncomfortable truths about their discriminatory social attitudes. As a result, the media punished her by betraying her speech in this manner and thereby permitting the sexist abuse against which she spoke out. So moving on to Hanson-Young's case. So though Parliament's sexist culture clearly has not changed since Gillard's era, strides have been made in the mainstream media coverage. However, some of this coverage remains. In fact, we found many of the same trends identified above in the misogyny speech in the coverage of Hanson-Young's slut shaming, such as playing the victim, dismissing claims of sexism, and the risk of further isolating male voters. Yet this trend does appear to be changing, with more voices in the media rallying in support of Hanson-Young. In comparison to the coverage of Gillard's speech, most articles actually acknowledge Leyenhelm's slut shaming, his comments as slut shaming, and critiqued the institutionalized sexism in politics, which indicates some kind of progress. However, we need to remember that it was the media that allowed Leyenhelm to amplify his slut shaming comments in the first place. Moving on to Julia Banks, the media response to Banks follows a similar pattern to that of Hanson-Young. Both experienced supportive as well as negative coverage that portrayed them as playing the victim, doubting the accusations, and deflecting the issue at hand. Women who call out sexism, such as Banks, Hanson-Young, or Gillard, are assumed to be playing the victim because enablers and regulators of the patriarchy do not consider their criticisms to be real instances of sexism, misogyny, or bullying. This kind of coverage exacerbates sexist abuse in Australian politics, as it silences those who speak up about sexism and bullying while shutting down further conversations about these issues. It upholds the patriarchal parliamentary norms that excuse and protect those men who abuse their power. However, like with Hanson-Young, Banks's accusations were largely supported by many in the media. Some used her case to examine wider issues of institutional sexism, or to analyse the Liberal Party's so-called women problem and lack of gender quotas. These examples demonstrate a positive change in media coverage of women politicians speaking out against sexism. So to conclude, the examples given in this paper suggest that Parliament can indeed be a toxic environment for women. So what then needs to change in order to make it a safer space for all? There needs to be basic and fundamental structural change, such as induction programs, proper formalised training programs, and an independent complaint system so that people feel protected and secure if they do make a complaint. Political parties must also ensure that MPs do not make sexist comments, and that involves cultural change. And obviously, the reason we're here is that we need a parliamentary code of conduct. Such reforms need to be reinforced by changes in the broader culture so that poor behaviour is penalised by voters as well. But the media also has a crucial role to play in revealing and critiquing sexist behaviour rather than exacerbating it. To achieve tangible change in political culture so that Parliament is a safe work environment for all, political editors, journalists and commentators need to critically analyse the gendered messages they might be communicating. A simple way of achieving this for more subtle instances of sexist reportage would be for writers and editors to reread a piece about women politicians and consider what they might change if they were instead written about a man. For more blatant circumstances, some institutional reform is also needed, such as a media code of conduct that condemns and combats sexist imagery, language, and practices. Reforms within Parliament are essential, but they need to be backed up by broader cultural and institutional change outside of Parliament as well. Thank you.
Fantastic. I did forget to mention earlier that we do have a Padlet, and if you haven't scanned the QR code, please do. Also, Michelle and Adam have a secret way of getting it onto computers. So if you want to use it on your laptop, have a chat to Michelle and Adam. I'm just implicating you now, Adam, but you can do it. Things that should absolutely go on the Padlet from Blair and Carol's presentation are things like induction programs, complaints mechanisms, political party responsibility for members' behaviour, their own members' behaviour. Surely they might take some responsibility. And of course, there are lots of fields in the Padlet about the code of conduct. What kinds of grievance mechanisms should we have? Who should be responsible for it? Please add your suggestions, add things that you're hearing from the conversation today and tomorrow. Thank you very much, Blair and Carol. Marnie. Marnie is a PhD student at Griffith University. How did you get here when Susan wasn't allowed to?
Yeah.
No, we won't tell that.
No, I made many.
Okay. No, I actually don't know if that's the case. You're working on millennial women's relationship with money management, but you have one of the most enticing titles of a presentation I've seen for a while. Take it away.
Okay, so the research I'm presenting today was completed and published in the course of my honours thesis, and it has a look at the gendered narratives used to frame two incidences in which women have breastfed in Australian parliaments. The data consisted of 349 news media articles, and these were analysed through a qualitative theory-driven thematic analysis and supported by a quantitative content analysis. The focus was on the way the breastfeeding body was depicted in the text and received in terms of either belonging or being out of place, with particular attention given to how the spatiality of Australian parliaments was constructed. In February 2003, newly elected Labor Party MP Kirsty Marshall attended her first question time in the Victorian Parliament with her 11-day-old infant. After taking her seat on the backbench, Marshall began to breastfeed before being ejected on the basis of breaching standing orders by bringing an unelected member into the chamber. 14 years later, in May 2017, a Queensland senator from the Australian Greens, Larissa Waters, breastfed on the floor of the Senate under 2016 amendments that made exceptions to standing orders for lactating politicians. A few weeks later in June, she also became the first senator to breastfeed while proposing a motion. So both events generated national and international coverage and stimulated vigorous debate about the appropriateness of breastfeeding in public, the presence of children in the workplace, and the participation of women in politics. Newspapers are valuable data sources, a powerful mediator of cultural norms. Journalism's duty is to imbue the public citizenry with the knowledge required for informed deliberation to allow for meaningful, robust democratic participation. Because of the crucial role national media and political journalism play in the co-creation of a healthy citizenry, mediated representations of women in civic life matter. They matter in particular for establishing the parameters and limits of our knowledge and thinking about our social world, especially as it relates to insiders and outsiders. The research finds evidence of reporting which perpetuates limiting gender stereotypes and drawing on biologically determinist ontologies. And as such, any opportunities for an ethics of care in supporting women negotiating masculine workplaces were forsaken. And this speaks to the need for improving the quality and democratic surplus of media practices. Working with theory on the breastfeeding body, spatiality, and practices of gendered reporting, I draw on Puar's scholarship of Space Invaders, which describes the social spatial impact of race and gendered bodies when they enter parliamentary spaces from which they've previously been excluded. Upon arriving in Westminster, space bodies which disturb and destabilise previous spatial knowledges are able to illuminate architectures of exclusion. And feminist geographers have argued gender is a key dimension through which spaces are produced, imagined and transformed, while an aspect of gendered performance is engagement in spaces that confirm, reproduce or contest gendered subjectivities. As we know, one of the most critical ways in which gender and space have been co-constituted is through the division of public and private. As the primary providers of caregiving labour, women continue to have limited access to social arenas associated with authority and decision-making power. So we can understand women's exclusion from aspects of citizenship as being dependent upon their participation elsewhere, that is, their participation in the private domestic domain. While the historical dominance of biologically essentialist narratives has caused feminists to be wary of corporeal theorising, Beazley and Bachi propose adopting an understanding of the body as an object of policy, as a product of power relations, that different bodies make different policies. As such, breastfeeding illustrates how some bodies resist confinement to the normative ideal of separate individual self by conceiving of citizenship as fleshy, as Beazley and Bachi argue, a challenging of the Cartesian mind-body binary via the corporeal performance of maternal labour allows for an understanding of maternal bodies, not as a barrier to participating in the sphere of politics, but as the site of politics itself. The findings, firstly, the framing of Marshall and Waters in relation to the socio-spatial registers of Parliament produced a set of theme which constructed the breastfeeding body both negatively as out of place and as leaky and messy, tainting the seriousness and gravity of the political sphere. This was mainly achieved via humour, which trivialised and sexualised the politicians, having the effect of belittling her mandate and undermining her civic value. Sexism in politics is often used against female MPs as an avenue of attack. For example, Marshall was mocked in a Herald Sun editorial where a journalist wrote that her breastfeeding meant she could easily embark, quote, on a career as a page 3 girl. This purported attempt at humour is reflective of the type of serious sexual harassment received by women in politics more generally, with many arguing that sexual humour is a form of male control, which works by stripping women of their professional integrity. The trivialising and delegitimising of Waters' breastfeeding in Parliament featured heavily and unsurprisingly in opinion editorials published in Murdoch-owned tabloids. The Daily Telegraph, for example, framed Waters as virtue signalling, returning to identity politics and being obsessed with political correctness. Presented as privileged and insular, Waters was derided as being self-indulgent and illegitimate, rather than represented as a mother seeking to meet the dual demands of maternity and employment. The online backlash directed at Waters in particular was highly sexualised, as you can see behind me. The ABC and other media outlets reported on this text message. In many of the texts, the lactating body was viewed as transgressing increasing levels of prescribed discretion, which range from breastfeeding at home to breastfeeding in public to breastfeeding in the workplace. In transgressing idealisations of feminine modesty through disrupting traditional spatial constraints, containments imposed upon care work, Marshall and Waters' public lactation resulted in accusations of bad motherhood, which were then mobilised to argue that if they were bad mothers, similarly, they'd be poor representatives. The second finding, breastfeeding as reinscribing parliamentary space as masculine. Arguments as to why breastfeeding should not occur in the parliament relied on constructing parliamentary spaces in particular ways. Writers often delineated between different parts of the parliamentary precinct, so separate to legislative offices, the public gallery or cabinet rooms. The chamber was constructed as a consecrated space, drawing on metaphors which likened it to the church or courts and even a surgeon's theatre. In analogising the parliamentary chambers with these professional spaces, the threat of the lactating body as a risk to rationality, cognition and sterility is heightened. Another way in which the parliament was framed as inappropriate for breastfeeding was through presenting it as an everyday workplace, and this allows for those who disagreed with Marshall and Waters to qualify their arguments, saying that while they were supportive of breastfeeding in public, the workplace is a different story. These ad populum appeals to common sense stifled conversation directed at the nexus of power and gender and political life, and worked to marginalise and exclude explorations of parliament as a gendered workplace. The final finding did reveal counter discourses which challenged parliamentary space as masculine, and this did provide a more positive narrative which argued the breastfeeding body as indicative of increasing female presence. And this provided a space, albeit a very small one, for other women in politics to name and challenge the gendered way in which the Australian political landscape operates through describing their experiences. In summary, the derision and abuse of the two parliamentarians couched as humour not only circumscribed conversations about parliament as a gendered workplace and space, but reinforced the hegemonic masculinity through which Australian politics is practiced. In their lactating corporality, Marshalls and Waters illuminated a very particular embodied subject that has been able to masquerade as the universal, and evidence that despite the normative view that legislative space is now open to all, the archetypal politician in Australia continues to be equated with a socially specific body. illicit in its nonconformity to the somatic norm. Through refusing to be contained within the epidermis, the lactating body refocuses our attention on how corporeal prejudice continues to marginalise women's undisputed access to governance. Hence, by understanding citizenship as fleshy, we render visible gendered power relations and allow voice to new policy agendas that are inclusive of the realities of social reproduction as they exist under capitalism. Thank you.
I just want to use the word fleshy. Thanks very much. A lot there to unpack, I think, Marnie. Thankfully, we've got more time because I forgot to mention to our dear listeners that we are one presentation down today. So plenty of time. Start thinking about your questions because there'll be a wonderful discussion following our final presentation from the amazing Dr. Pia Rowe. Dr. Pia Rowe is a research fellow at the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation. She is the project lead on an Australian study on the division of unpaid labour at home during a pandemic. We had to start talking about it at some point. Pia, up to you.
Thank you for that introduction, Sonia. That was really lively. So for the next 8 minutes, I always find this time constraint a little bit difficult because I tend to waffle a little bit. I'm going to be really specific. I'm going to be talking about care labour in reference to parliamentary duties. And basically, what I wanted to start off with was an anecdote from my early sort of years of after PhD. I started studying women's representation and unpaid labour. And I had a very senior male professor came up to me and basically said, look, you don't really have anything to go on here, like you're a bit late too. And I'm like, care to elaborate? And he said, well, we've already had a female prime minister. And I was like, okay, so do you really consider this to be a success story? Because to me, there's a little bit things are still missing. And he said, well, you do have more opportunities than my mum had when, you know, in the 50s, 60s when he was born. And I'm like, okay, so interesting yardstick we're using here. In that spirit, I am here because I have the audacity to ask for more. And I also have the audacity to just suggest that we shouldn't just shut up and be grateful for what we have obtained so far. But so firstly, I really want to just have a quick look at what I mean when I'm talking about care labour, because I just want to highlight that it's not just the looking after your children, which is what it often comes back to. It takes many forms. It can be in the both paid labour sector, it can be in the unpaid sector, and it goes way beyond just the children aspect, which is something I will be talking about very shortly. And the reason I'm saying this, you know, I don't want to put you all to sleep with all these mundane facts, but we do need to understand the broader context within which we operate. So we all know that the parliament, as you know, as a sort of workplace, it is really unique. There's zero doubt about it. But, and this is my big but, it still operates within the broader society. So even though the parliament has been particularly resistant to change, the broader societal norms are still reflected in the parliament as well to some extent. And, you know, we look at the statistics and we keep hearing the same story over and over and over again. When it comes to care labour in Australia and, you know, globally to some extent as well, women tend to keep doing most of it still today. And during the COVID pandemic, the situation was further amplified, it was exacerbated, and there's just no ifs and buts about it. And look, I'm not going to go through these statistics because you can all see them there. What I want to go on to the more meaty stuff is, what does care labour look at the moment in terms of parliamentary duties and in the media? So here we have some examples I've compiled from recent years. We have, like in 2017, as people have already highlighted, we started getting this glimmer of hope when babies were finally allowed on the floor. People could breastfeed in the parliament. They didn't get kicked out anymore. And we're very grateful for these changes. They are all positive, but we need more. So as Marion Saw has pointed in the past, when the new Parliament House was opened in the 80s, it had a squash court, it had meditation rooms, and it had a swimming pool. kids, who would want them in the workplace? It took decades of active campaigning to get a Grace in the Parliament House. It took decades to get to just this point. But more importantly, there's something that's missing from this picture. Like, let's start from the very basic fact. Oh, sorry, I'll go back for a little bit. Let's start from the very basic fact of life. Babies grew up. Grace is amazing. Till they are 3, that's great. They're sort of looked after kind of in a way. But how far will it go when the whole system is unfriendly to families as a whole? So first of all, I wanted to quickly highlight the disability statistics in Australia. So in terms of gender distribution, the statistics are fairly similar in terms of who it impacts, but who does all the caring? About 3.5% of the whole population at the moment are primary carers in Australia doing unpaid disability care. That's nearly 1 million people. And guess what? 7 out of 10 of those carers are women. We have the growing sandwich generation. So people who are looking both after their own kids and their own children. And we have people who don't look after kids at all. They just look after whoever, relatives, family members. So in that vein, my colleague Jane Alder and I did some pilot interviews with female parliamentarians a couple of years ago. We were talking about their unpaid care duties. And this is basically what kept coming up in the interviews. If you have caring duties that go beyond kids, you are basically invisible. Those duties are invisible. People also highlighted the fact that, you know, there's differences in terms of where you're located. Of course, ACT is quite easy and I'll say that it's relatively speaking, of course. For the parents, they can go and they can sleep in their own beds at night. If you are located on the other side of the country, it's quite a different story. We had some pushback as well from these interviews. We had one person who argued that, okay, the role of the supporter, like, you know, it's no different for men when they are doing the supporting role. So it's hard to be a supporter regardless of your gender, and this is true. Of course it is. But the fact is, we can't ignore the contextual, you know, reality of it, where women still do most of the caring. If women are the carers, yes, we do need to enable this sort of the family-friendly workplace for all, and it will come, but it will always have to work within the broader societal change. So we need to look at those care provisions more holistically. And as Professor Hill has noted, you know, the pandemic, first we had the bushfires, then we had the pandemic. And what those two things did, they exposed the weaknesses in the already broken system. So, you know, these have existed for decades, but care and work, they are part of the same coin. Like, they go hand in hand. And at this point, I really just want to point out a quick anecdote. I'm always banging on about Sanna Marin because I do love my, Finnish Prime Minister. But when she took on the role, Sanna Marin obviously is one of the youngest politicians in the world, heading country. When she took on a role, she had a baby becoming a toddler. And she said in an interview in the Finnish media that, yes, she would relocate to Helsinki, the capital city, as soon as she would get a childcare spot for her toddler. She was relying, the thing that I want to highlight here is that she was relying on the exact same public universal childcare system as every single citizen in Finland does. And the thing about that, the thing that's remarkable about that is that the childcare system works for absolutely everyone. It works regardless of who you are. It works whether you're in the paid labor force or not, and it's accessible after hours during summers. And in other words, she could keep caring for her child, and she didn't need to deny her role as the parent in order to run the country. I wanted to come back to the issue of travel quickly. I know I'm running out of time here, because in the Australian context, of course, travel is a massive thing. And when Warren Snowden, when he retired, he had calculated that over the 3 decades when he was in politics, he had spent 2 years of his life traveling. Now, regardless of whether you have babies or you're caring after, what your family looks like, that's a massive, that's a massive ask for anyone. That's not something that comes easy. That's not something that we can just fix overnight. But I think, and what this conference today also shows, we had people all of a sudden who couldn't be here on the day because of the border closures, they have been able to join us online. And I think this is one of the positives that we can perhaps take forward going on from here. We can look at that. Do people always have to be in Canberra? Can they perhaps do some of the things from where they're located so that we don't ask people to spend 2 years of their life on the plane? And I think I'm going to leave it there because, you know, I've said a lot already, but yeah, there's some, of course, things that we need to talk about, how we're going to change those structures to make them more family friendly for absolutely everyone, but we can talk about that later. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia. I think I'd like to share an anecdote as well. So my son was a resident of the Parliament House childcare facility for about 2 years. If anyone's watched Annabelle Crabb's amazing piece or binge watched it like I did on Tuesday night, you will know that, yes, it took 20 years to establish. And when it was finally established, it replaced the members bar. And one thing that I will always remember is that one of the childcare workers said to me, "It is exactly on the wrong side of this building. It gets no sun in the afternoon, it's freezing, and it gets none of the morning sun." So it was all in the wrong place. It should have been on the Senate side, according to her. But I think that anecdote says to us what the thought processes that occurred in the creation of that space. It was the path of least resistance. Let's just use something that we aren't using anymore and turn that into something that's not even purpose built, because children can only be there until they're 3 years old. So members of parliament really then still have a massive problem when they turn 3, not to mention parliamentary staff and political staff. So there are many, many other additional problems with the creation of that childcare centre that don't get mentioned very often because of the massive achievement that it does represent of 20 years of work. On that note, we already have a hand up. So lots and lots to discuss. Thankfully, we have about 40 minutes. So yes, hello. Yes, let's be controversial.
As a sector, I mean, we're mostly universities. As a sector, we don't necessarily have all of the answers to these problems ourselves. So I worked at federal parliament before I had children. But when I brought a 3-month-old baby to a university conference 4 years ago, it was not welcomed. And I'm actually having an interview with a new PhD student next week who's doing some work on this kind of discrimination about, you know, losing your job at home baby. So yeah, it was not welcome in the job I was in, and I was working for 40 universities, and to the point where, you know, I was told not to bring the baby back. She was 3 months old, and I had someone look after her, but I went into a private room to breastfeed. And I lost the job at the end of that year, and I put 2 and 2 together. So I think you know, I'm inspired by people saying speak out, but I think we also just need to be aware that perhaps as a sector we've got a little bit of a way to go when it comes to a lot of issues. But you know, this session has been about, you know, the small children and breastfeeding, and I think it's fabulous that women are. You know, I think women have just got to keep bringing babies to the workplace and say we have to just not just accept it, but it's a positive thing. You know, and unless we keep doing it, and I've realised something for that position. Yeah, I think our sector can really inform a better workplace at federal parliament, but I think we could also inform, you know, better, more positive experiences for women in the broader community as well.
I think that speaks to your point, Pia, that the workplace of Parliament House occurs not in a vacuum, but in the social norms of our society.
Exactly. In Australia, we are, you know,
dreadfully behind when it comes to those norms. Like, you know, the statistics when it comes to the caregiving norms and things like that do keep showing that women do the bulk of the labour. So, yeah.
Any other members of the panel who want to speak to that issue of broader cultural reluctance or resistance to workplace, to family-friendly workplaces?
Oh, sorry, no, you go.
No, you.
No, I was just going to tell a frivolous anecdote again because I do love them. When I first started doing my PhD at UC, I had like 2 kids under 4, and it was during the first year of my PhD they tried to make the place more family friendly. And all of a sudden I had this person came up to me and was like, "Are you breastfeeding?" And I'm like, "I don't know. Do you need milk? Like, why are you asking?" And she's like, "Oh, we just made it like a breastfeeding friendly space here." And I was like, "Okay, so where is it?" "Disabled toilet." And I'm like, "This is not breastfeeding friendly. This is not family friendly."
Disabled friendly.
Yeah, and or disabled friendly. I would not take my baby to a toilet to feed. You know, it just goes to show how much work we have to do. Like, you know, and that's just with the babies. You know, sorry, back to you.
No, I think just picking up on that again, you know, thinking about these spaces and these projections of absences of bodies that are going to inhabit these spaces, you know, professional work organisations, universities, Parliament House, these are all the assumptions of the bodies, you know, that we are retrospectively refitting them for women's presence without any of the thought process around what it is that a childcare centre may actually require. I think universities, yeah, in particular, you know, I don't know, I can't speak to ANU, but at Griffith there is certainly very limited breastfeeding facilities that have been provided. There is a singular room which I have searched for but am yet to find, but you also need to obtain a key from that room for various places. And then you know, there's no childcare centres, there is none of that sort of thing. So I think the structural and the spatial elements that we need to put in place to be able to support women to do that, because it does, you know, it does disturb people's thinking around, knowledges around how we perform in the workplace. Maternity is not welcome in those workplaces. It's still very much on that traditional public-private, masculine-feminine divide.
Can I pose a question to everyone? Because I was just wondering, like, everybody roles. Because I was just wondering in terms of that, how do we keep asking for more and at the same time then stop people from saying like, well, you already got this, like, aren't you ever going to be happy? Like, what's their response? How do we
Crush the system.
Yeah.
On breastfeeding though, I will say that the Department of the House of Representatives went through an accreditation process. And so it became, and I am very conscious that it did that because one of its senior executives had the experience of breastfeeding her child in the car park. So I don't know if anyone's been to the car park in Parliament House, yeah, but underneath, in the dark. So her husband would bring the child, she would feed the child in the car park. Now, I think that experience informed, I think, what we can only call her championing of breastfeeding accreditation. Now, that was for a department. It's not necessarily for the entire house. Thank you. You had a question.
Mine's more a statement. I work for Chief Minister, so ACT government. We changed our legislative assembly, changed our practices. So we have family-friendly workplace for the Action Chamber. So Julia Jones in 2015, first MLA to breastfeed in the chamber. Prior to that, Katie Gallagher breastfed in the building, in cabinet, but they actually changed the hours of the assembly. So we stop at 6 o'clock. And if we need to keep on going, we do, but there's a break to allow people to go home and be with their families. The other thing that we have found is that my chief of staff has Fridays off to look after his children. Children are welcome in the building because across the board we work long hours, there's different needs. So it's not just the women that are reflecting that they have families, but the men are also reflecting that they have families. And so like school holidays, COVID, it's been a bit crazy. There's been a lot of children in buildings, holiday plans and programs just went kaput. So I think Parliament, at least the ACT Parliament across the board, we changed our behaviour, primarily because our female MLAs started to have children. So in the ACT, our cabinet is 9 and we have 5. So that's where the change starts.
Yeah, the ACT Parliament became one of the first chambers to have more than 50% women. Yeah. So that has a huge impact. Kim.
Follow on from that, I think session on the ACT Parliament as a leader and all the additions, and perhaps that's the message today. We just need the federal Parliament to look the way the ACT Parliament.
Yes, that must.
But what I want to come back to is about the issue about being family friendly, and it's just come out so many times, and it's really the essence of this presentation. How do we make society more family friendly? Once we make it in all aspects of our lives, wherever we're working, then that has to somehow influence the ways in which the structures operate. So your example just then is a perfect example of how COVID has altered things and will change our ways of looking at things. We need to amplify things, and my question is, how do we amplify a change so that rather than work fitting around families, rather than families fitting around work, we create a society where the expectation is that work fits around family.
Can I jump in? I don't know if you can see me.
We can see you. Hello.
Hello. Can I jump in just very briefly on this topic? I think a lot of you all are hitting on some really key and critical concerns that comes up a lot in our research. One of the things is reframing this around being a gendered issue, although yes, of course, women are disproportionately impacted by family demands and the lack of availability of things, but really shifting this around fixing women or figuring out how women can fix the problem and shifting it towards a family approach, or even better, a caregiving approach, because we think about little kids, but people are carrying multiple family demands and other caregiving demands. And I just add one other thing. So Andrea, Carson, and I collected data looking at what was happening under COVID, in particular around housework and childcare. And one of the critical things we found was that actually Australian men stepped in. They stepped into more housework and they stepped into more childcare. And that was quite different from what we saw in the US, where actually the men did not step in under the lockdown. So you have a group of men that are interested in equal sharing, that want to be equal parents, that want to have kind of more diverse and interesting family and work lives, but you're hitting that institutional constraint. And if we keep focusing on women have a role, but as I think shifting it towards caregiving more broadly, and the role of men and women together who have these kind of shared concerns and shared desires, coming up with effective strategies and policies to ensure that everyone, regardless of their gender, regardless of whether they have babies at home or parents or friends or relatives that have caregiving demand, have the space and capacity to do that. And that, I think, is a little bit of a shift in the conversation.
Thanks very much, Leah. And I appreciate that, and we probably didn't point out, but you are a co-author with Andrea. And of course, yes, very important. Lovely to see you. Thank you very much for your work. Yes, we had a question up there, and then we'll go to the back.
How do you balance, I suppose, Blair, maybe this is a question for you, sexist commentary that goes on with Julia Gillard face or not having children, like if she's barren or somehow late to women or being proper leader, this idea versus to be a real woman, to be a real female leader, you must have children, but then parliaments such as at the moment in this place how do we balance these in these what it means to be a woman and a leader when it seems to be impossible to have too many children or not enough children, woman or not woman enough.
And now I've been asked to repeat the question for the good people on Zoom. I'm so sorry that I haven't been doing that before. But the question is, really, we're kind of damning if they do and damning if they don't. These women who are either mothers, parents, and we criticise them if they are. We also criticise them if they're not, in the case of people like Julia Gillard. Blair.
Yeah, great question. Thanks. Funny that you mentioned that. I'm currently have an article under review about the family trope, as I call it, how women in politics are constantly framed in relation to their family, whether it's as a mother or as child-free or as wives, or I mean, in my thesis, but not in this article, I also looked at as daughters to fathers, rarely their mothers. Interesting. We're constantly related to men. But yeah, going back to that mother question, or I call it the mother/child-less bind, and I say childless as in lacking children. I do prefer the term child-free for myself as a child-free person, but I find it quite interesting that, yeah, it is damn if you do, damn if you don't. Essentially, if you have children, then, you know, a lot of women in politics get the question of, well, why aren't you at home looking after them? Or, you know, you can't do your job properly, or blah, blah, blah. But if you don't have kids, they're like, well, you're not relatable to the public, therefore you can't do your job properly. You're not a proper woman, you know, you can't win. And I think it's really funny I'll throw an anecdote myself, not a personal one, but, you know, when Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison were asked the question by a journalist, I think it was last year or the year before, who's looking after your children, you know, because they both have young families. They were like, what? What's the question? Like, because men are rarely asked that, you know, women are constantly asked these questions, whatever choice they make in terms of their, you know, family and reproductivity. But in terms of balancing that, I mean, we just have to stop bloody referring women back to their family. It's kind of like forcing them back into the private sphere. You know, you're a woman, you must be a mother, you must be a sister, we're always compared, we're always thought about in relation to who we like belong to, essentially, or, you know, how we relate to men. I think that we need to not look at that, but at the same time also push for parental and caregiving rights. And I do like the term that was mentioned, you know, caregiving, because it's not only looking after young children, you know, being parents, it's looking after your parents, or looking after, you know, caring for many different kinds of people. You know, it's not just it doesn't just look the same for everyone, if that makes sense. So yes, long run.
Thanks very much, Blair. Chris.
Adding to the discussion about parliamentary hours and arrangements and so forth, you can only do so much with hours, especially with federal parliament. And I think we need to kind of crash through fast to the point where we embrace technological solutions to this rather than press hours. And one of the things I have in the back of my mind when raising this is one of the strongest pushbacks on changes to hours I ever got was from a mainstream party, very senior male politician, very traditional one, who violently reacted and said, look, the minute you cut back on hours, you make us sit a longer number of weeks each year, and that keeps me physically away from my family, and I can't stand it. And this guy actually left politics prematurely because he just couldn't stand it. So I think really this caregiving thing is so much at the heart of how we get a more diverse representative body in Parliament. Without diversity, you can't get genuine inclusion. And caregiving and arrangements for caregiving is absolutely one of the critical factors. We would so much faster progress on this issue if we just went, well, it's okay to Kate Ellis is sitting fortnight to be a parliamentarian, coming in from Zoom, from the city of Adelaide, voting electronically. As I was saying all this, I thought of those things you get in cafes that start vibrating from ships. You know, if you get one of those instead of the frequency dogs we've got to vote, it's so obvious the breakthrough change in terms of making parliamentary work possible for people. But I just think we need to kind of crash through how we get a more technologically savvy up to the 21st century way of doing parliamentary politics scheduling until we kind of get on to that.
Thank you, Chris. For those people staying at home, technological solutions rather than compressed hours. That's my compression of your comment. We have a question here. We've got so many questions, and I'm really sorry, Alicia. I know you also have a question online, but this lovely lady's been waiting, looking at me.
This is moving back a little bit now, but I'm just interested in understanding a bit more about the research about men stepping up, because I was during COVID, because I was very much from research I've seen under the opposite impression, particularly things like the Big Health survey, which showed that 76% of the women that answered that survey said that their caring responsibilities increased during COVID, and only 8% of men, and so on. So yeah, just wanted to understand.
What
what is the research behind men stepping up? Yes, go. Andrea and Leah.
Leah, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, it's not an either or. Like, you're absolutely right. Like, there is no doubt that this pandemic hit women harder, knocked women out at higher rates. I mean, the long-term consequences are more dire, and in particular for women. So yes, women increased their housework, but what was interesting is that men increased their housework and childcare too. Not to the rate that women did, but we have one of what I think is the only longitudinal sample of Australians and American men over 3 time points. And what was interesting was the Australian men did step in at the beginning, and then they held that higher rate of housework into September. What happens? We have a new wave that we just got in May, where they might drop off, right? It might be a temporary thing where they just stepped in and did a bit more, and then they drop off over time. That is an open question. Yes, but sorry, just to be clear, yes, women stepped in and did more, but men stepped in too. And in the US, they didn't. They stepped in the first wave in May, and then they dropped their housework and returned back to basically baseline. So there is something unique about what was happening in Australia, but that's not to undermine women's experiences too.
And if I could just add to that, we also found in the survey data that women were a lot more stressed than women were. We looked at the economic fallout, and they were, and lots of other studies have found the same that we did, that they were at the front line of losing jobs, of having precarious work. And that was reflected in sleep patterns, which was one of the things that we examined, where men said they felt calm most of the time. Women were rarely feeling calm during the 3 different periods that we surveyed them, which it showed this heightened and constant level of anxiety.
Can I add one more thing? Sorry, I'll be very brief. It just that it builds upon a broader research showing that men are interested in being equal sharers and equal carers over the longer period of time. And so I think sometimes we often think about these things in silos, you know, like people with kids versus not, or men versus women. And a lot of times these things cross, and actually the desires that people want to have is to step into caregiving roles in a more meaningful way, but there's an institutional block that hasn't been alleviated. And so I think that's an important thing to consider when we think about how do we create unity, how do we create social movements, how do we create policy change, and thinking less around the cleavages and more around the overlaps as an effective strategy.
No, don't do that, Leah. We want to hear from you. We also want to hear from you, Marion.
Thank you, Sonia. I just want to try and bring a couple of things together. One of which is distrust of politicians, which is rising, as we all know, and means that any suggestions for additional expenditure on family-friendly measures, such as, you know, more travel allowance to bring small children and carers to Canberra with the MP and so on, is regarded as snouts and trough. So I think that's why the kind of technological solutions, which have been raised a few times today already, are so important, because they don't really cost more money to the taxpayer. Anyway, that's my input.
Now just rephrase that for people at home: distrust of politicians and the problems of heightened expenditure for MPs. And can I just make a shout out to my co-author at the back there, the delightful Dr. Karen Baker, who found exactly that in the case of New Zealand. It's a co-publication, look it up. Yes, very important point, Marion. Hello.
I just have a quick question, sort of away from the child care side of it. When we speak about women who have been involved in politics through sexism, we talk a lot about some of the women that spoke about today, so Gillard, Banks, Nancy Young. Often I find that Emma Husar's story gets overlooked in these discussions. I'd love to know why you think that is.
Why are we overlooking Emma Husar? I think that goes to you, Blair, and Carol.
I'm trying to think. Hard question. Carol, would you like to answer that question? Sorry. No, it's fine. Carol there?
Carol looks like she's getting ready to talk.
I unfortunately couldn't hear the question clearly, so could it be repeated?
Yes. Why in your research or others' research have we been overlooking the case of Emma Husar?
Yes, I mean, we had difficult problems choosing who we were actually going to cover, because there were so many cases that we actually could have covered. And we wanted one Labor, one Greens and one Liberal politician. And we decided to start off with Gillard, partly because the case was so awful, but also because of the Anne Summers, her rights at work speech, which we thought was really important for this workshop. But Emma Huzar's case is really important, and certainly, you know, she certainly felt that it demonstrated examples of slut shaming and some of the other phenomena that we've examined, and that it also, of course, involved some problems within the Labor Party. And certainly in our paper, we would not be suggesting that the problems are confined to one political party. So yes, Emma Huzar's case is certainly one that is well worth examining in more depth.
And she's also on Annabelle Crabb's program, so I really encourage people to have a look at that. I really have to ask Licia Heath's question, because otherwise I will get into so much trouble for bad chairing. Licia Heath, who is the CEO of Women for Election Australia, is asking a question of Andrea and Leah. WFEA is currently training 120 women to run in the New South Wales local government elections. These women are now faced with having to pivot their campaigns into online campaigns, and they're worried their campaigns will be adversely affected. You mentioned COVID has had a positive result on women's campaigns in the Victorian local government elections. Is this because women were better at social media campaigns, or because the incumbents, men, question mark, weren't bothering with online campaigns?
Thank you for the question. It's a great one. And congratulations on having so many female candidates trained, ready to go. This was a really big issue in Victoria before the October elections, so much so that many advocates of gender equality were asking for the election to be postponed because they thought that there would be a dearth of women wanting to put their hand up to run, and that they wouldn't be fair elections, fair and free elections, because you wouldn't have the candidate base. In fact, the opposite occurred. It was the highest number ever recorded in Victoria of women putting their hand up, with the highest number ever elected. And from the survey responses we got, where we specifically asked about COVID, we found that for some women, they saw it as a potential barrier, but others really revelled in the idea of being able to campaign from home and to use their online skills while also juggling childcare responsibilities and the homeschooling and all those sorts of things without having to hit the streets. But the other thing we found was that you may remember that in my presentation, I said more men had done more terms in local government than women had because they start earlier and they, I don't know whether they're gluttons for punishment or what it is, but they keep putting their hand up. They weren't able to use their skills of visibility that they had in the past of door knocking and doing the glad handling in the streets. So in some ways it equaled the playing field in a way that hadn't happened before. So we do see that for some it was daunting, but for others it was a real opportunity to be able to even that playing field. Did you want to add, Leah?
We've also had another online question. Thank you very much, Andrea. From Katerina. Noting that as Katerina understands it, only one press gallery journalist has publicly admitted their regret at the media coverage of Julia Gillard during her prime ministership. How do we fix the media's reporting of women in leadership, given the competitive nature of the news cycle beyond codes of conduct of practice? And Katerina, can I add, beyond the adversarial nature of party politics? Excellent question.
I mean, there are a few things that can be done that I guess are easier. I mean, one is have more women in the media, you know, and at all levels of the media, particularly when it comes to politics. I think the last Women in Media report from 2019 conducted by Jenna Price showed that in terms of the topics of government and politics, not that many women are writing about that, whether it's opinion pieces or on the news itself. And I think opinion pieces is where it kind of cuts deep, you know, but that's where a lot more of the sexism comes from than in the news, although yes, it does happen there too. But I think having more women in the media at all levels, as, you know, as editors, as the decision makers, I think would go a long way to improve the scenario. But also, I don't mean to, like, you know, jump on the bandwagon, but the Murdoch press is a tricky one. You know, my research has shown that a lot more, the Murdoch press kind of, a lot more sexist coverage comes from Murdoch press, and it kind of facilitates the way we think about these issues and the way that these kind of things get talked about. And I examined, you know, that compared to other countries, like say New Zealand, where there's no Murdoch press, no tabloids, nothing like that. And the coverage is a lot more formal. It's less, you know, sexist. It's less, I guess, like dirty politics, if that makes sense. And it seems that, you know, that kind of, it does encourage that kind of culture, that tabloid culture that does affect women particularly. So I think that's another one. We need more diversity in the media in terms of media ownership, less conglomeration and more diversity, please. But it also comes down to the reader as well, I think. You know, if that kind of stuff sells, then what does that say about us? And perhaps we, you know, should be more critical as readers into this, and also, you know, read the media and examine the messages that are being sent. And I think that's one of my goals, my life goals, is to really encourage those conversations everywhere, not just in academia, but, you know, outside of academia, for everyone to come to the media and social media and critically think about the messages they're learning.
Yeah, and just a shout out to Kim and her team's organisation of the Equals Now Symposium, which showcased the work of the ABC in trying to get 50-50 media commentary. So really encouraging more diverse women's voices in the way in which, you know, in terms of expert sources. So actually, I think, you know, when you talk about more women, but across all of the institutions of the media, but also in the sources of the media, and that program has been incredibly successful. I hadn't heard of it, but it was really interesting to hear about.
To add on that, you know, the gender makeup of journalism in Australia is pretty much 50-50. You know, there are 55% of women, so it really actually is at that upper echelons that you need to change to set the cultural standards. And yeah, as Blair has said, that is difficult when you have such a concentrated ownership, which I think again comes back to, well, what is the role of the press? The role of the press is to inform the citizenry, right? So how can it act as both a commodity and a public service? There's a problem with the market model that we operate on for journalism. But there's also a problem in the way that we educate our journalism students. I think there is a lack of intellectual rigour that we try to instill, certainly at the journalism schools that I've been at. It is a lot more practical work that is given on how to produce your reporting, rather than, I suppose, training around the social dynamics about how the world can be constructed, the world can be written, the importance of mediated representation. Similar to the statistics you were sharing, you know, I think it's about 13% of people who are quoted on financial issues are women. It's incredibly low. So for students to have that training, that induction, that understanding, that you know, to sort of push back against that bullshit idea that journalism is objective. It's not. It is very, very subjective. It always is. You adhere to a code of ethics, yes, and, you know, you try to meet the standards of your readership and your masthead, but this is something that you are creating. It does not stand external to these realities. So, you know, I think that sort of goes into the way that we talk about care workers and families too. The male politicians are a lot, it's that Julia Baird's media tart said, you know, it's long been a thing that the families of male politicians sacrifice and female politicians, their families suffer. You know, we know Barnaby Joyce, every time Christmas rolled around, trot out the 4 girls and the wife, and we'll do an International Women's Day photo or a Christmas family photo or whatever. But, you know, as Kate Ellis wrote in her book, she had to be so careful about what she did share of her family, and this pushback that, well, you're not doing your job properly if you're that involved in your children's life. So the way that we teach journalists to understand, you know, stop relying on these highly individualist binaries of public-private. You cannot have workers who do not have care. Workers need to be cared for so that they can go out to the workforce in the same way carers need to work because they need to be paid. So they're not separate, as Leah said, it's interrelational. And I think that's something that we sort of miss in the way that the social complexities, I think, is something that's missing in the training of journalism students too.
Just jump in there quickly, sorry. It also, I think, is a cultural thing. I mean, in my research, I examine the media and I say that, they kind of, reinforce these gender stereotypes and traditional gender norms. But that isn't something that, I don't think they're necessarily sitting there like, I'm going to create gender norms.
No.
Yeah, it's something that, they develop through just being in our society. And so we need, true societal and cultural change there in the way we view women, the way we view caregiving, the way we view all those sorts of things. Otherwise, it's going to be replicated in the media, which then reinforces. It's a cycle, it's constantly reinforcing itself.
And I'm just going to add to that media ownership as well. Like, we need to look at the role of the big tech, like, the social media companies. Because Facebook, a couple of months ago when we didn't have the news for a couple of days there, coming through Facebook, like, it was amazing. And every year, University of Canberra, basically, they do this in collaboration with others, they do a digital news report, and which looks at how Australians consume their news. And the number of people, like, given that most of our citizens access news via social media platforms, when they are, anyone who's basically had the control of like a Facebook or Instagram page knows how difficult it is to keep on top of the algorithms and how do you get seen and all that. And the news companies are having that exact same problem, which then feeds back to this, let's make clickable stories, it has to stand out. And it's such a huge cycle, and I'm not entirely sure how we can break that, given that when you look at the big tech ownership, well, that's even worse, I think, than the traditional media ownership in the hands of like two people rather than
two men.
Yeah. And I think it goes back to what you were saying, Marnie, in your presentation, that it's the sexual humour. Now, if only we could just think that was funny, but unfortunately, many of us get tainted with, well, we just can't take the joke. I don't like the joke, but the fact that, but it's that kind of clickable news story. This is just funny. It's just a bit of fun. I'm not seeing any hands, so that's good because I have another question from the Zoom. It's from Bronwyn Curry. She says, the National Women's Safety Summit has been postponed. Do you find this as outrageous as I do? At this critical time, why has this decision been made? And we have the technology, we can Zoom. I'm going to skip a little bit, Bronwyn, but the question is, does the panel think that the Women's March for Justice across the country in March this year made a difference? I might start with Carol.
Yes, it is a problem that it's been that it's been delayed. On the other hand, there are, as we can see in this meeting now, there are COVID restrictions in place with state borders closed and so on. So I can understand the rationale behind delaying it. But yes, it's obviously incredibly important that these issues continue to be prioritised. And I do think that mass protests have played a role in shifting the Morrison government's policies slightly in some respects. So it's very important that that pressure be kept up on the government, and certainly that crucial issues are addressed, particularly issues such as violence against women that have often in fact been exacerbated by the pandemic.
Thanks, Carol. Andrea, Leah?
I echo Carol's sentiment that it's good that these things are front of mind, and pressure needs to be brought to bear to keep them there. Leah and I have also been thinking about these questions and are about to embark on some research with ANU colleagues to see whether the March for Justice and the Brittany Higgins experiences is a turning point that may shift attitudes towards quotas, particularly with Conservative voters. I leave it to you to guess what might come out of that research. It's going to be experimental research, and I'll hopefully have another opportunity to let you know what the results are when we get them in. But I think these are really important issues, and we're keen to research them as much as anyone.
I think we're keen to know the answer already. To the panel here.
March for Justice. I hope some changes happen. But I also think that, I don't know, I just don't have much hope in this government really, but I guess that's after 2021 and everything that's happened. And after we saw the Respect at Work report be tabled for what, over a year, you know, yes, the inquiry, the Cage inquiry has come out, you know, with the pressure built up from things like Brittany Higgins, from like, you know, the March for Justice, but will that get tabled? We need to constantly put pressure on this government, and that is what I want to also emphasize from this workshop. This workshop is brilliant, you know, and I've been organizing it for months, but we need to, like, after today and tomorrow, we need to keep putting pressure on this government. We need to keep talking about these issues in order to make change happen, because they, you know, I think that so often with this government, when the spotlight is not on them, they just go back to normal. So, you know, in March and April, Scott Morrison had to play the marketing man in terms of appearing like he was friendly to women. But then, you know, COVID happened.
He was very friendly. He didn't shoot them. He said that they were friendly.
And sorry if my voice is like steeped in sarcasm, but, you know, it's a lot. And, you know, they were trying, I guess they didn't want to lose too many women's votes, so they were doing these kinds of things. And then, you know, you go away for a few months, you look away and you go back and you're like, wait, actually not much has changed here. And we need to keep making sure that doesn't not happen. We need change to happen now.
We need change to happen now. I think that's a really remarkable way to end a fantastic session. Thank you to Andrea, Leah, Carol, Pia, Blair, Marnie. All well done.